I used to believe that marriage meant growing together, lifting each other through life's ups and downs. But over time, it started to feel like I was the only one evolving, while Lorraine, my wife, was drifting somewhere I couldn't reach. The change came gradually. At first, I chalked it up to a phase. She had fallen in with a new group of friends, confident, self-reliant women who seemed to thrive on independence. They often spoke about how men were nothing but a burden, how romantic relationships only stifled a woman's potential. Lorraine had always had a strong personality, but something shifted. The way she looked at me changed. It wasn't with the affection I had grown used to, but with a sort of distant coolness. One evening during dinner, I realized she barely glanced at me anymore. Her focus was on her phone, her laughter reserved for someone else on the other end of the screen. I reached out for her hand instinctively, a familiar gesture we used to share. She pulled away without even acknowledging it. "You're always on your phone these days," I said, trying to sound casual and not let the hurt seep through. She let out an irritated sigh. "It's just my friends, Dean. Not everything revolves around you." I gave her a small smile, masking the ache inside. It wasn't just her words, it was how she said them, as though I had become more of an annoyance than a partner. At first, I turned inward, blaming myself. Maybe I had lost my charm, maybe routine had dulled the spark. So I made an effort. I arranged spontaneous outings, cooked her favorite dishes, and even tried to show interest in the topics she often discussed with her new circle. But with every step I took toward her, she seemed to retreat even further. Then one night, she returned home far later than usual. Her makeup was flawless, her hair elegantly styled like she had just left a formal event. But she didn't say a word. She walked past me silently and headed straight for the bedroom. I followed her. "Where have you been?" I asked. Standing before the mirror, she ran her fingers through her hair, inspecting herself as if her appearance mattered more than the question I had asked. Then she gave me a smirk, cold and unfamiliar. "Why does it matter to you?" she replied, her tone eerily casual. That was the breaking point for me. In that moment, something inside me splintered. I could feel it, something had shifted beyond repair. And deep down, I couldn't shake the suspicion that the effort she put into her appearance wasn't for me anymore. For the next several weeks, I tried to dismiss my growing doubts. I told myself I was being irrational, letting paranoia cloud my judgment. Lorraine had always valued her autonomy, and maybe I was just struggling to accept that. I clung to the hope that this was temporary, that she'd eventually return to the woman I knew. But as time went on, that hope started to wear thin. Her time was consumed by her friends, who now visited often. When they gathered in our living room, they barely acknowledged my presence, treating me like a forgotten decoration. Their voices were loud and filled with confident laughter, often circling back to how women didn't need men, how marriage was a trap. They mocked men who showed too much affection, suggesting that strong women had no obligation to cater to their husbands. And every time Lorraine joined in on those laughs, it felt like another cut. One evening, after they had left, I finally asked her, "Is that really how you feel? That marriage is just some kind of shackle?" She looked bored, sipping wine as she lounged on the couch. "You're being too dramatic, Dean. They just see things differently, that's all." I wanted to take her at her word, but the tone in her voice and the emptiness in her eyes made it impossible. Still, I told myself to let it go. I hoped that with enough time and space, she would find her way back to us. But the more space I gave, the more distant she became. She stopped coming to bed when I did, often staying up late to watch shows or message people I didn't know. When we did talk, our conversations felt hollow, like she was checking off a box rather than engaging with me. And sometimes she wouldn't come home at all. In the beginning, she offered vague reasons. "Just a girls' night," she'd explain while slipping off her shoes. "We had a little too much to drink, so I stayed at Dana's." But the inconsistencies were hard to ignore. The scent of unfamiliar perfume lingered on her clothes. She avoided eye contact, her posture tense whenever I got close. I didn't want to accuse her of anything. I didn't want to become that husband who questioned everything without cause. So I stayed silent, waiting for the truth to show itself. It did sooner than I had expected. One evening, I came home earlier than usual. I had planned a small surprise, maybe dinner out, hoping to rekindle something that felt increasingly distant. But the moment I stepped inside, I sensed that something was wrong. The silence in the house wasn't peaceful, it was the kind that unsettled you. And then I heard it, the soft sound of a voice coming from our bedroom. I stood frozen, heart pounding so hard it felt like it might break through my chest. I moved a little closer, trying not to make a sound. Through the narrow opening of the door, I heard Lorraine's voice, low and urgent. "I just need more time," she said. "He still has no idea." That word, clueless, hit me like a jolt. The floor beneath me might as well have shifted. I pushed the door open slowly. There she was, holding her phone, her face draining of color as she realized I'd heard every word. The silence that followed was heavy and tense. Lorraine didn't move. Her fingers hovered above her phone screen like she wasn't sure whether to hang up or pretend she hadn't been caught. The moments stretched out filled with a tension that didn't need to be explained. I could hear myself breathing, the sound oddly loud in the quiet, and my pulse thudded in my ears. "What did you just say?" I asked, my voice more stable than I felt, even though my hands were trembling. She blinked, opening and closing her mouth, clearly struggling to come up with an excuse. Then she gave a short, forced laugh and shook her head. "Dean, you're seriously overthinking this." I stepped toward her, and I saw her grip on the phone tighten. "You called me clueless," I said again, needing her to acknowledge it to confirm I wasn't imagining things. Her eyes rolled and she sighed like I was being unreasonable. "It's just a thing my friends and I say," she replied. "You're always so wrapped up in work, you miss stuff." I didn't buy it, not even a little. For months I had been feeling something was off. I'd convinced myself it was just my imagination, blamed it on stress or insecurity. But not anymore. I took a deep breath and made myself relax. "Who were you talking to?" She hesitated just for a beat. "Dana." I looked her straight in the eyes. Lorraine was good at lying when she wanted to be. But after spending 10 years together, I knew her well, every subtle shift in her face, every small tell. She hadn't been talking to Dana and she could tell I knew it too. Instead of coming clean, she kept going. "We were talking about how distant things have been," she said. "You're emotionally unavailable, Dean. You barely say anything unless it's to criticize. You don't try anymore. I need more than this and you can't even see it." I took a step back and let her words wash over me. She wasn't trying to explain or apologize, she was deflecting. She didn't feel guilty about what I overheard, she just wanted to make it my fault. I didn't respond. I turned and left the room. She didn't come after me. I sat alone in my car for more than an hour, hands gripping the wheel, eyes locked on the dashboard like I was waiting for it to give me answers I wasn't ready to hear. Deep inside, I already knew Lorraine was hiding something. And I couldn't pretend things were okay anymore. Later that night, when she finally got into bed, she didn't say a word. She just turned away from me and pulled the blanket over her shoulder like nothing had happened. Like everything was perfectly normal. For the first time in our marriage, it struck me I was lying next to someone I no longer recognized. The next morning, Lorraine acted like the night before had been erased. She moved around the kitchen casually, pouring coffee, glancing at her phone, humming as if nothing was wrong. It felt surreal. I had barely slept, my mind spinning all night, but there she was, completely composed. I thought about asking her again, but what was the point? I had heard enough, seen enough. Confronting her would only lead to more denial, more manipulation. She'd try to twist it, make me doubt my own memory. So instead, I stayed quiet. I sat there, sipping coffee, my eyes on her every move. She felt it. I saw it in the brief pause before she took another sip, in how tightly her fingers wrapped around her phone. That tiny flicker of tension told me everything. She was watching to see if I would bring it up again. I didn't. And just like that, she eased back into her usual rhythm. It was a subtle shift, barely noticeable to anyone else. But to me, it said everything. She believed I had let it go. That whatever she was hiding was still safe. And right then, I understood exactly what I needed to do. For the next few days, I played along. I acted like the man she thought I was, clueless, detached. I asked about her day. I didn't flinch when she had friends over. I even nodded when she said things like how women need their independence and shouldn't rely on a man. I made no accusations, no sudden reactions. Because I wasn't just watching anymore, I was waiting. Then, 2 nights later, it happened. She had spent the entire evening glued to her phone, barely acknowledging my presence. I sat nearby, pretending to work on my laptop. In reality, all my attention was on her. I began to notice the subtle shifts in her behavior, those faint, secretive smiles that played on her lips, the way she'd gently brush her hair behind her ear whenever a particular message appeared on her screen. She always angled her phone just enough so I couldn't catch a glimpse. Around 9 in the evening, she stood and stretched lazily. "I'm heading out," she mentioned in a nonchalant tone, as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. Looking up briefly from my laptop, I pretended not to care. "Where are you going?" I asked, keeping my voice flat. "Just out for drinks with the girls," she replied. I gave a small nod, keeping my expression unreadable. "All right, have a good time." She lingered, hesitating slightly, like she was hoping I'd say something more, maybe expecting a reaction. But I didn't give her one. I turned back to my screen. That's when she smiled, not at me, but to herself. It was the kind of smile someone wears when they believe they've just won a game the other person didn't know they were playing. With her coat in hand, she left, softly humming the same tune she'd been obsessed with lately. The second the door clicked shut behind her, I sprang into action. I reached for my phone, opened the tracking app one had discreetly installed the day after overhearing a suspicious phone call, and watched as the small blue dot, her digital footprint, moved across the city. But she wasn't heading downtown to a trendy bar. Instead, she was headed toward a residential area I didn't recognize. My hands balled into fists as I stared at the screen, a heavy thudding growing in my chest. This was it, the confirmation I had been dreading. Lorraine hadn't gone to meet her friends. She had gone to see someone else. I stayed rooted in place for a while, just watching that tiny dot as it settled in one spot. She wasn't out with her girlfriends. She wasn't sipping cocktails under dim lights and laughing over shared stories. She was nestled somewhere in a quiet neighborhood I had never been to. A typical husband might have called her right away, demanded the truth. But I wasn't going to hand her that chance, not yet. Confronting her now would only give her space to manipulate the narrative, to spin lies, or flip the situation back on me like she had been doing for weeks. I needed proof, not just from a screen, but with my own eyes. So I grabbed my keys and got in the car. The closer I got to that neighborhood, the tighter my chest became. I had imagined this moment countless times, each scenario worse than the last. But nothing had prepared me for the actual weight of the truth. My grip on the steering wheel turned my knuckles white. My breathing slowed, focused, and shallow. And then I saw it, her car, parked neatly in the driveway of a home I didn't recognize. A lovely, two-story house with large windows and a well-maintained exterior. It was the kind of place that suggested the owner was successful, comfortable. Not somewhere a single man usually lived unless he had money. I parked a few houses away, kept my lights off, engine running. And I watched. I waited. 10 minutes. Then 20. By the time 30 passed, a curtain shifted. A silhouette moved inside. The front door opened a moment later. Lorraine stepped out onto the porch. Her hair was slightly messy, her coat casually slung over her arm. She turned back toward the house, a warm smile blooming across her face. A figure appeared in the doorway, a man, tall and broad. My stomach twisted violently. She leaned toward him, said something I couldn't hear, and then she laughed. It wasn't a polite chuckle or the half-hearted laugh she gave me lately. It was real. Genuine. The kind of laugh I hadn't heard from her in what felt like ages. I gripped the steering wheel like it was the only thing anchoring me. Then she walked back to her car, completely unaware I had seen everything, and drove away. I didn't follow. I just sat there in the shadows, staring at that house, the one she had just walked out of, feeling everything inside me shift. My world didn't just crack, it rearranged itself around a truth I couldn't ignore anymore. Lorraine wasn't just drifting away emotionally. She wasn't just tired or distracted. She was involved with someone else. And the worst part? She didn't even seem remorseful. The drive back home was a blur. I couldn't recall the turns or the streets, just the mix of headlights, taillights, and the gentle hum of my car. My mind felt both numb and chaotic at once. 1,000 thoughts swirled, yet none of them made sense. Despite the storm inside me, the one thing I didn't feel was shock. Because deep down, I had always known. I just never thought she would be bold enough to prove it so blatantly. It was like I was running on muscle memory. My body drove the car, but my thoughts were stuck on that image, her, stepping onto the porch. That unguarded smile. The way she had tilted her head up to him, eyes full of something I hadn't seen directed at me in months. I remembered when she used to look at me that way. When I finally pulled into our driveway, my fingers felt stiff around the wheel. The house was dark except for the soft glow of a lamp in the living room. I knew she was already inside, maybe reapplying her makeup, possibly sending a final message to him before slipping into bed beside me as if the night had been uneventful. I stayed in the car for a moment, staring at the house, trying to summon the courage to walk through that door. But for the first time, it didn't feel like my home anymore. It felt foreign. Eventually, I did what I had always done. I forced myself to move. I stepped inside, let the door close quietly behind me, and walked toward the bedroom. The faint trace of her perfume still lingered in the air, the same fragrance that had clung to her when she left that man's home. She was already lying in bed, her back to me, absorbed in whatever was on her phone. When I walked into the room, she barely looked up. "You're home late," she said casually, her tone light and unconcerned, as if she hadn't just been in someone else's house, laughing, touching, and doing who knows what else. I swallowed the lump rising in my throat. "Yeah, work kept me longer than I thought." She let out a nonchalant hum but didn't follow up with any questions. She didn't want to know more. That indifference, that's what cut the deepest. I slipped into bed beside her, but it felt like a chasm stretched between us. This bed, once a sanctuary for whispered dreams and wordless affection, now seemed like a line dividing two strangers sharing the same roof. We used to reach for each other instinctively in the dark. Now, I didn't dare. Lying on my side, I stared at the ceiling. I could hear her breathing, hear her fingers tapping against her screen. The thought that she might be messaging him twisted my stomach into knots. But I stayed quiet. I didn't ask. I didn't confront. I just let the silence wrap around me like a shroud. This was the new normal. Pretending I didn't know. Acting like nothing had changed. But deep inside, I could feel the cracks forming, and I wasn't sure how much longer I could hold myself together. By the time I opened my eyes the next morning, Lorraine was already up. That alone was odd. Mornings were never her thing. From the bedroom, I could hear the gentle clink of a mug, the soft shuffle of her slippers across the floor, the gurgle of coffee being poured. For a fleeting second, I wanted to believe that maybe last night had been a bad dream. Maybe I hadn't seen my wife walk out of another man's home, laughing like a teenager discovering love for the first time. But when I turned my head and noticed her side of the bed was untouched, perfectly made, the truth snapped back into focus. I got out of bed slowly, every movement deliberate, uncertain of what kind of day lay ahead. Would she pretend nothing was wrong again? Play the doting partner? Or continue to treat me like I was invisible, the way she had been for weeks? When I entered the kitchen, she stood near the window, a steaming mug in her hands, her attention locked on her phone. A small, private smile touched her lips. She didn't even realize I was there. "You're up early," I said from the doorway. She flinched slightly and quickly locked her phone, flashing me a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Yeah, just couldn't sleep." A lie. But I didn't say so. I watched her instead, the way her fingers clinked against the mug, the way her eyes darted away from mine just a second too long, the subtle fidgeting that gave her away. I decided to push a little. "How about we go out tonight?" I suggested, trying to keep my tone light. "Just the two of us." She paused, then forced a smile that almost looked convincing. "Oh, I'd love to, but Dana and the girls already planned something for tonight. I promised I'd be there." I nodded slowly, pretending to believe her. "Of course." Relief softened her expression. That's when the realization struck me, she wasn't even making an effort to hide it anymore. She wasn't cautious, wasn't covering her tracks. It was like she expected me to just accept it, to quietly let her drift away. The thought made me nauseous. Had she ever truly loved me? Or had she simply been waiting for an excuse to walk away? I wanted to demand answers, to force the truth into the open, but instead I stood there holding my coffee, the ceramic warm against my skin as I gripped it tighter than I should have. Maybe I didn't want the truth. Maybe I wasn't ready to hear it, and that scared me more than anything else. That evening, she left again. Same story. Same practiced smile. Same hollow reassurance. But this time I didn't sit at home in denial. I couldn't pretend anymore. I had seen the truth with my own eyes. So I followed her. Keeping a safe distance, I trailed her car with my headlights off. She didn't glance back once. She didn't need to. Lorraine had built her world on the belief that I'd never question her, never step out of line, never see through her. The route was familiar now. It burned behind my eyes, the same neighborhood, the same driveway, the same man waiting on the other side of that door. I parked further down the block, tucked out of sight, and watched. She exited her car with ease, not a hint of hesitation in her step. No fear. No guilt. Just that same carefree grace, like she was heading exactly where she wanted to be. She knocked, and the door opened almost instantly. He stood there, tall, self-assured, his gaze locked on her as if she were already his. She moved closer, murmured something too quiet for me to make out, and then she kissed him. It wasn't a hesitant brush of the lips or a fleeting, guilty glance. It was a full, deliberate kiss. The kind that told a story all on its own. The kind that erased any uncertainty. I let out a slow breath, my hands tightening around the steering wheel as an unexpected calm washed over me. In that instant, something within shifted. The anger faded. The hurt dissolved. All that remained was clarity. I was finished. For countless months, I'd held on, waiting for some kind of explanation. Hoping for a moment of truth, a flicker of realization in her eyes, some sign that she might come back to me. But now it was clear. Her decision had been made long ago. What she never expected was that one day I'd find the strength to make mine. That night, I didn't wait around for her to walk through the door. Instead, I headed directly to my lawyer's office, regardless of the late hour. I composed a detailed email, every bit of tracking information, all the timestamps, the discreet photos I'd taken when she wasn't paying attention. When she came back the next morning, I was already gone. There was no note left behind, no emotional showdown, only an empty space where I used to be. And when she finally reached for her phone, probably anticipating another text from him, a little surge of excitement, what she saw was something entirely different. My final message. "I know everything. Don't bother coming home." That was the last time I ever saw Lorraine. And I never once looked back with regret.